नमस्कार। केंद्रीय माध्यमिक शिक्षा बोर्ड द्वारा आयोजित आज के इस कार्यक्रम में आप सभी का स्वागत है। Good evening to everyone. This webinar is the sixth in the CBSE NEP webinar series, which marks the completion of 1 year since the launch of the National Education Policy 2020. As we continue our discussion on the steps being taken towards fulfilling the vision of the NEP, today the focus would be on structured assessment for student learning, or SAFAL. To formally welcome all dignitaries, the panelists, and the participants, may I request Director Academics, Dr. Joseph Emmanuel, to do the honors. Please, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Shweta. Respected Chairman, CBSE, Mr. Manoj Ahuja, Dr. Andrish Dohari, Director, CBSE, Dr. Amita Vatal, Mr. Karthik, Ms. Ritika, Sri Sridhar Rajgopal, Mr. K.K. Chaudhary, Dr. Jayashree Ojha, Ms. Vaijayanti Shankar, all the eminent panelists, all the principals, teachers, and all the officers and staff members joined us on this platform. As Dr. Shweta has rightly said, this is the sixth webinar on the CBSE NEP series, and all the webinars were well received by all the stakeholders. Today is a new theme, SAFAL, Structured Assessment for Learning. The key stage assessment as envisioned in the new National Education Policy is going to be translated into reality, and CBSE has taken many initiatives under the leadership of our chairman. And all the panelists present here today, they are all working in the field of education and assessment. We have very eminent panelists. All of them have contributed in their own way for the development of education. And CBSE in particular is looking at teaching learning reforms, assessment reforms, and creating learning environment in all the affiliated schools and the states where CBSE has presence. So it is going to make huge difference. Present, our focus is on assessment at the end of the school education, that is at class 10 and 12. And the SAFAL is going to bring a shift to the current assessment pattern. Assessment will start from the very beginning. Assessment is a very powerful tool, and this powerful tool will be used for the development of children. That is the beauty of SAFAL. And with the support of all the assessment experts, this is going to be presented in a most beautiful manner. And we have eminent experts like Sridhar Rajgopal, who is the brain behind asset examination in the country. And we have experts like Dr. Vatal and Ms. Vaijayanti Shankar. She herself is a psychometrician as well as a diagnostic expert. And Ma'am Ojha is also there with her vast experience in the field of assessment. Karthik is also an educational expert with the World Bank. And with this eminent panelist expert view on the SAFAL as well as the key stage assessment will definitely going to enrich our audience today. I have the honor of inviting our chairman, Manoj Ahuja, to give the keynote address of today's webinar. And I request sir to come forward and give the keynote address and open the webinar up. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. My colleagues from CBSE and very eminent panelists who are available today, all the participants who joined this webinar, a very warm welcome and a good afternoon for this session. Let me also tell you, all those who have joined us, that it is indeed going to be let's say a very useful session, because the people we have today on the panel are very eminent personalities in the field of assessment in India. And we do look forward to hearing their viewpoints on SAFAL and assessment in general. All of you are aware about the national education policy and the priority and the importance it plays on assessment for bringing about qualitative changes in the education system. It is a fact that a lot of our studies, pedagogy, objectives of education are driven by the way we assess it. More so in a country like in India, where it's very competitive, and summative exams also, do carry out a duty, something like a filtering or a sorting function also, besides assessing. The Honorable Prime Minister had launched SAFAL on July 29, marking 1 year of announcement of the National Education Policy. And SAFAL has the potential of being one of the major instruments to bring about qualitative changes in the system. And why do I say this? SAFAL will have learning outcome based assessment at standard 3, 5, and 8. So it will focus on key competencies, learning outcomes, and the instruments would be, for any such exam, would be standardized. And therefore, what it implies is that the ability of these instruments to measure those competencies will be it will follow a very rigorous process and would be able to do that quite well. And this standardization in terms of boards, bringing about that standardization in an assessment is perhaps a new thing. And we hope it will spawn many such efforts around the country. It will provide introducing competency-based learning outcome-linked assessments will nudge the entire country towards bringing in learning outcomes for and banking or establishing their assessment on that, which is again one of the aims of the national education policy. Second is it will give very good feedback to schools at very early stages, at grade 3, which I think is also very important when we are talking about NIPUN, foundational literacy and numeracy. It will be able to assess that. Grade 5, grade 8, and these are very crucial stages. So even for individuals and for schools, it will provide diagnostic feedback. And I would raise one caveat here. There is always a danger with the way we have a culture of competitiveness that these diagnostic instruments would also slowly, become competitive examinations. And the way we are structuring it is to ensure that does not happen, but with everybody's cooperation and allowing an enabling environment, it should be able to meet the objectives which we have set out for it, which is essentially a diagnostic tool and a feedback for the schools and also for individuals. And if you put this in, then obviously, like I said, for foundational literacy and numeracy, individual and school feedback at different stages, it will be able to do that. And we are developing it in a manner that not only CBSE schools, but if states are interested, we will be able to provide these instruments to them in the coming years. And for this, CBSE would be investing heavily in building up the expertise and the human resource pool and the technology systems which can carry out psychometric analysis and do analysis for the schools, of the results. It's not only that they get the results, but an analysis which will be understandable by a school, which it can act on, is something very important. So we are building a technology system for that. So this is just a broad overview. I think we have extremely eminent people here. And with that, Joseph, just giving an overview, I think I'll hand it over to you. And with the other participants, I also look forward to listening to all who are presented. Thank you so much.
Sir, thank you. Thank you for laying the context, for emphasizing the key gains that schools and teachers can hope for as they embrace SAFAL, and also for elaborating how SAFAL could be a game changer if we adopt it in a collaborative and a developmental spirit. Now, taking the webinar ahead, it is indeed my honor and privilege to introduce the eminent experts who are a part of this panel. we have with us Dr. Jayashree Oza. Welcome, ma'am. She's a senior advisor at the Central Square Foundation with more than 30 years of experience in the field of education. Dr. Oza specializes in the area of educational management with a focus on leadership and institutional development, policy research, curriculum development, pedagogy, and capacity building. She has been a team leader for the Technical Cooperation Agency to the Government of India through a multilateral funded program for 10 years. An extensively published author, she brings a very rich experience of curriculum at various levels. Welcome, ma'am. Besides that, we have Sridhar Rajgopalan. Sridhar ji is an educational entrepreneur. He's an alumni of IIT Madras and Ahmedabad. He has co-founded the Eklavya School at Ahmedabad. Besides that, he has also co-founded Educational Initiatives Private Limited, which is working extensively in the area of student assessment. Under Sridhar's leadership, EI has conducted many large-scale assessments on student learning throughout India, as well as other countries of South Asia. Welcome, sir. We have with us Ms. Ritika Paro. She's Director Education at the British Council. As a part of the British Council's education team for the last 12 years, Ritika ji has been leading the development and strategy and implementation of school programs in India. In fact, she has worked designing and implementing many British Council's flagship programs that bring the best of UK and India together. She has been a big part in the designing and delivery of the CBSE competency-based education program, where various implementations of the NEP have been brought to the ground level. Welcome, Ritika ji. We also have Vajanti Shankar. She's the founder and executive director of Center for Science of Student Learning, one of the leading providers of diagnostic assessments across South Asia. CSSL works in India as well as globally on educational assessments and also builds the institution's capacity for the same. Vajanti ji specializes in psychometrics, in item response theory, diagnostic assessments, as well as social emotional learning domains. She has the experience of working extensively in India as well as Southeast Asia. We also have Karthik Pendal, who's an educational specialist at the World Bank. His work entails supporting the government of India as well as the state governments in designing and implementing projects in the areas of school education and skill development. He has experience of working across more than 10 states of the country, specifically in the area of foundational learning, teacher professional development, learning assessment systems, as well as vocational education. The moderator and the person who's going to weave the whole program from now on would be Dr. Amita Mulavatal. Ma'am is the chairperson and executive director, Education, Innovations and Training at DLF Foundation Schools and Scholarship Program. She has worked in the sphere of education, creative arts, special needs education, English, women's education, and curriculum development. A recipient of the National Teachers Award as well as the Endeavour Award from the Australian government for her work in the area of Asia literacy. She has the deep practitioner's understanding about how children learn, not only in the classroom, but beyond it too. Ma'am, I give over the platform to you, so in order to conduct the program further.
Thank you very much, Shweta, for that. And I would like to firstly thank our chairman for having had these series of webinars across the country, along with our academic director, Mr. Joseph Emmanuel, for the brilliant work that is being done and the way that we as educators are profiting from these seminars and webinars. Thank you so much for that. Now, today is a particularly important occasion because we're going to be discussing assessment. And I think that's always been a sort of a talking point as far as educators are concerned, and sometimes a stumbling point. And it is so wonderful that all of you here, so eminent, are going to have a discussion with us on what you think and how you look at the whole world of assessment, because it is something that we really need to understand. And I think the purpose of assessment essentially would be to attain a sort of an understanding of the learning outcomes and map to the learning domains. And that's what we're looking at by designing learning and teaching initiatives, and finally conducting formative assessments to measure attainment of these learning outcomes. I think essentially if SAFAL is practiced in letter and spirit, it'll change the face of our classrooms and in turn will create a very thinking school, which will help in measuring students' performance against defined learning indicators if deconstructed well. It will play a very pivotal role in measuring progress and creating a learner profile, which will transform the face of schoolrooms in India. I would like to start with my friend Ritika, and someone who's been very involved with the understanding of assessment and has done a deep dive into the NCERT curriculum and the CBSE syllabus by assessing the pedagogies required for this transaction, breaking it down with the understanding that content need not be changed, but the teaching pedagogies and lesson plans have to be indicative of assessment. So with that, Ritika, I leave the place to you. Would you like to comment upon what I just mentioned? Ritika, thank you.
Thank you, Amita. It's a pleasure to be on this forum and to share what we are doing with you. Essentially, in my role in the British Council, my aim and objective is to bring the best of British, expertise in this area meaningfully. So it's not a case of lift and shift, but a case of co-creating a program that works for the beneficiaries in the end. And with this view in mind, we began the journey by inviting ENIC, which is an organization in the UK that works on qualification equivalence and has specialist understanding of how to evaluate systems, to work in a consultation with CBSE to understand where there is need, because you don't want to tinker where there is no need to change. So to identify how to bring about the most impactful change with the limited resources we have in hand, because ultimately resources are always limited, in that sense. And with that in mind, we came to the conclusion that we would like to use assessment to improve teaching and learning, because they're so intricately linked with one another. There's a marriage of the two in our project would be a key kind of area. And one of the things that ENIC came back and said to us, and our instruction to them was to do something which was very doable, not to go into very difficult to implement kind of a thing, and to take our teachers and our schools with us on the journey. So we began that journey, and our aim was to transform ourselves from being a very content focused system of education to a very competency based and skills focused. So I do want to share with you literally a 4-minute video, which I think explains better than I do what we tried to do over that period of time. And I'm going to request my colleague Peenal to share that video if that's possible. Peenal, do you want to come in and share the video now? So while Peenal is trying to get us onto the video, I'll go on to add that what we did was we worked in 3 parts, and we looked at the NCERT curriculum, and we realized, are you able to hear me, Amita?
Yes.
Yeah, so we realized that there is no need for a major change within it. It's a great document. It has great strengths. But what we need to do is deconstruct it for the teachers and link it with granularity to more, to make it more understandable to the teachers to transact within their curriculum. And as a result of which, we created 3 documents, or we aim to create 3 documents. 1 is already out there, and 2 which will come, which will kind of link up the curriculum, the CBSE syllabus, with the assessment outcomes and the test items and question papers. So, the mosaic of all this, contributing to the whole teaching learning process as such. So are we ready to go, Peenal? Do you want to start it? Thank you. If you aren't able to hear this or have difficulty, we are also going to put the link in the chat box so that you can look at it directly from your laptops or wherever you're accessing it, and you will be able to get the gist of the program. Peenal, the audio is not coming through.
Perhaps Ritika, you could tell us what is being said. So
Yeah.
that would be interesting.
So I think now it's easier because it just says that the project supported the NEP 2020, moving us on from a content-based education system to a competency-based system, and to towards that to create higher order thinking skills to the teaching.
Competency-based learning enables high-quality education in real-life context. It emphasizes on predefined competencies at each level of the student's learning journey and takes them beyond the confines of their textbook, linking their learning to life.
We've worked to ensure that the assessments which will be created assess both the higher order thinking skills, such as analysis and evaluation, and the recall and application of knowledge. We've taken good practice from a variety of sources and worked with CBSE experts to design a framework which will deliver valid assessment of these higher order skills and which will be well aligned to the learning outcomes set out in the NCERT curriculum.
To support competency-based education, British Council entered into a partnership with the Central Board of Secondary Education in March 2020 and launched the Competency-Based Education Project. As a part of this project, British Council and its knowledge partner Alpha Plus, in partnership with CBSE India, present the Competency-Based Assessment Framework. Designed in collaboration with UK experts, the assessment framework provides professional development to education system leaders, teachers, and examination designers.
Our role is to support master trainers and DSTAG mentors the skills that they need to support teachers in the rollout of competency-based learning into the classroom. Our approach combines international expertise from the Faculty of Education, along with deep local knowledge from our Cambridge International team in India, to help produce a bespoke program that is aligned with the CBSE curriculum.
Under the direction and guidance of CBSE, the project uses assessment as a driver and motivator of change in teaching quality in the classroom.
The unique feature of this project is its whole system approach that focuses on creating an enabling environment. It helps CBSE in change management. It teaches for the continuous professional development.
Overall, the Competency-Based Education Project provides mentorship support for the teachers, embeds new learning into classroom teaching practice, guides reading, English, maths, and science teachers of classes 6 to 10 to drive practical learning, strengthens the capacity of schools to create high-quality competency-based question papers.
The project team combined a document review with on-the-ground experience, meeting with students, teachers, and CBSE staff. We focus on Standard 10 for maths, science, and reading, comparing to well-established international education systems. The final report made a number of recommendations to enhance teaching, curriculum design, and, in particular, assessment.
The Competency-Based Education Project aims to bring about systemic change in teaching, learning, and assessment practices by 2024. The project will not only make a lasting impact on the education ecosystem, but will also help students realize their potential so that they can fully contribute to making the country and the world safe, sustainable, prosperous, and peaceful.
I thank all the UK knowledge partners and the teachers and education experts in both countries who've worked to make the project happen. I'm sure that it will make a positive contribution to enabling high quality teaching to improve the learning experience and outcomes of all students in CBSE schools. British Council is committed to supporting India's education sector and its knowledge ambitions. We've been working in education for more than 70 years here, and this continuing rich and fruitful association brings benefit to both our countries.
So that kind of brings us to the close of the video, Amita. I'm happy to take questions on it, but just to say that the three assets that we will create will be freely accessible. Besides that, all the training materials that we have done will be shared with CBSE and will be available to Diksha on the Diksha platform eventually, and with the CBSE academic websites, which Shweta and her team will be able to guide schools to. And it's there, and we're going to run a series of more workshops to empower people to use the tools such as the question banks that we will create, as well as the learning framework, assessment framework, as well as the lesson plans to go from our side.
Thank you, Ritika, for that. We'll take the questions once we go through everyone, across the panel. I think the most important thing that came out when I was looking at the video was that the big shifts really require small changes.
That's right.
And it is the systems that finally change the system, as you rightly said once, that I think change has to come from within, and the collaborative system of prioritizing formative assessment, the fact that conducting authentic assessment for 21st century skilling, looking at all stages of foundational, preparatory, and middle stages, etc. I think that came out extremely well, and how it was emerging, developing, acquired, and proficient. And so that is a sort of a teaser that we got out of that. Thank you very much for that intervention. I will now move forward to Karthik. Karthik, your understanding of assessment is that it plays a very facilitative role in order to be transformative. And it requires support through various means. I mean, in our conversations, that's what I understood. So whether it's crowdsourcing, or whether it's remedial teaching, or multiple players from the system, and I'm sure that you are aware that CBSE has been very far-sighted in having created concepts of learning hubs several years ago, along with their Sahodaya clusters, which have been there for 25 years. And it is through this that they have created all these patterns of understanding and connections with innovation, and the models which have been embedded in the NEP, the discussions around pedagogy. So all this is very akin to the strong school complex concept that is being mentioned in the NEP. So what are your thoughts on kind of value that assessment draws, and what are the big shifts if we bring in, if we bring in the assessment in classes 3, 5, and 8? And how would you incorporate the ability of teachers, champions in your word, so that they can become stakeholders in the learning systems? Since we all agree that cascading models have never been successful. So Karthik, over to you.
Thank you, Amita ji. That's a very kind introduction to our summary of our conversation, and a very accurate one, because as a personal experience, when we have and also at the bank, when we've gone working across multiple states, I think we find that there was a step one, which was a recognition of the need to strengthen assessment systems, not as an end to itself, but as a means to an end, where it helps the state identify really the areas where it needs to focus its efforts on to improve the overall health of the system. But I think equally quickly there is this realization of assessment being the starting point of, yes, in some ways an ending point when we go to the end of school examinations, but a starting point which really brings in that information required to empower the system. And the system, in a way, is nothing else but our teachers and students at the end of the day. I would start by saying that I think the chairperson CBSE made a very valid point that when CBSE goes forward in really operationalizing SAFAL, it would not just be it wouldn't just be a contribution to all CBSE schools. It would be something that other state examination board states would look forward to emulate. In a federal structure such as ours, we have that decentralized autonomy at the grassroots to kind of do things innovatively, but we always look to each other or at the center for lessons that we can derive, and CBSE would in a lot of ways provide that or lead with that example, which brings us to this point that in that sense, what people would look for or look towards is not just SAFAL as it is self-contained, but also SAFAL as a piece of a larger puzzle which CBSE is going forward to solve, which is really a prudent plan that really drilling down into the lower grades to start orienting the system to move towards competency-based assessment and teaching learning, recognizing somewhere that every learning culture is different, and ours somewhere we must accept in India aligns with examinations and assessments. We respond to that, whether we call it as an assessment or as a benchmark. So really starting from that and demonstrating the role as a body, which really traditionally is viewed as someone most focused on examination assessments, how it leverages that to unlock these areas. And therefore, what are the processes and the methods and approaches which CBSE really rolled out along with the assessment piece, which led to the transformation at the school level. And therein, I just wanted to quickly touch on 2 points. I felt that the SAFAL, first of all, in the assessment picture itself, marks a starting point. We know that CBSE schools, most schools have very frequent classroom-based assessments, whether we like to call them unit tests, Monday test, Tuesday's test, Friday test, whatever we like to call them. They happen, they take place. And the first link, therefore, from SAFAL, rather than looking upwards to 10th board, is downwards to these unit tests, which really requires us to build the capacity of teachers to really take off and also start developing some expertise in terms of developing test items for those classroom assessments or regular checks for understanding the classroom, which are competency based. And we have colleagues with us on the panel like Vaijati ji, Sridhar, who have done this successfully with states in terms of building their capacities, teachers' capacities through classroom based, through their support as state assessment cells or technical partners. And I think here CBSE is playing that overarching role for their schools to really bring this expertise down to the teachers. And I think this is where one of the things we were discussing when you and I touched base, that really crowdsourcing test items, where CBSE as well as technical partners taking the role of kind of validating and curating items rather than taking on the burden of creating a large repository. So teachers start having that personal equity in the process, building in that enthusiasm, because wherever we've gone in states, we've realized that the challenge from moving from a curriculum to competency based teaching learning system is that the latter requires a lot more enthusiastic and involved teacher, because it's not just delivery of information. So the more we involve them in the process of creation of those test items and actually getting involved in the process, the more energized we'll find the system to be. And secondly, I would say also in terms of the fact that bodies such as CBSE, along with their learning hubs, as well as the fact that there is twinning of schools, the fact that there is a lot of peer-to-peer learning which can be facilitated in CBSE, because the schools have a certain degree of, I would say they're well off in certain variables, which an average government school in India is not, which means teachers can collaborate together to resolve issues. So not necessarily everything flowing top bottom in terms of instructional material or overly scripted material, or so simple guidebooks, probe points, discussion topics which teachers can really open up to support each other. Some of these mechanisms or channels if put in place, and just to conclude how they roll out, would be learnings for other states and examination boards, along with, of course, the rollout of SAFAL in itself. I'll conclude by saying that while we do all of this, again, within CBSE, I think it's important to appreciate that we have schools within CBSE which have varying means. We have CBSE government schools, we have CBSE on the more low cost, affordable side, the more high-end schools in terms of the fee structures and facilities infrastructure. And I'm not commenting on the quality of human resources here, but the wherewithal that they would have to perhaps seek technical support and partnership. Some may have it, some may not have it. Therefore, within this ecosystem, as we resolve and bring that whole system up in a level, lies the beauty of the lesson which can be emulated by other states and examination boards. I'll stop there as an initial set of thoughts, and perhaps when we come to a second round of discussion, there are more thoughts we could discuss. But I think I also look forward to listening to Jayashree ji, Vaijanti, Sridhar, far more experienced than I am, far more technically sound in this area than I am, and I with everyone else, look forward to hearing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karthik, for that. And I think the most important thing that is that the trust deficit that exists as far as teachers are concerned is something that, we have to get rid of. And I think what you were talking about, them being sort of champions who have to be integrated within the system. And so whether we create regional clusters, because it's very important, we can easily create these regional clusters, or at state, or at district, or at zonal levels. I think it is very imperative that teachers buy into what is being done and they become the sort of leaders of this. Otherwise, it should not remain at the policy level. And I think that's what CBSE is trying, and the scalability of CBSE, if it can be done by other states, I think that'll be absolutely remarkable. Having said that, thank you again. Having said that, I would now request Sridhar. It's very interesting that you've been talking about the quality of questioning. I mean, within the question is the quest, so to speak. And in fact, you have mentioned when we were talking that you have an internal team which sort of has been with you for 20 years, which is a long time, and who has created those the understanding of questioning, and which deals with assessment, testing, and questions. And I think it'd be interesting to hear your views on the continuum of learning and what are the reforms that we can bring about in board exam assessment, because your thoughts on, sample versus census and so on. So I'd be very interested to, and I'm sure all of us, to hear your thoughts. Sridhar.
Thank you very much, Amitaji. It's a pleasure to be here and great to hear the other panelists too. And very interesting questions that you asked. And, one of the things that we emphasize is that the question is the heart of the entire assessment. This is something that, the National Curriculum Framework during the 2005 process, there was a document, focus group on examination reform, that makes the same point. And that is something that we have seen to be very true working on the ground with schools, both the private schools as well as government schools. And how does one create a question that serves the purpose of that assessment, whether it is diagnosis, whether it is kind of at a selection stage or a board exam? And one of the challenges in our system has been that, as people have mentioned, we've kind of over the years slid to something which has been more content-based. So it has been more of content-based questioning and not this kind of understanding or competency-based questioning. One of the examples we give for this is to say that, the items should be unfamiliar items in unfamiliar contexts. At least some of the items should be in unfamiliar contexts, but real life and authentic data. So, for example, if I get into a situation where I talk of, I don't know, the heights of mountains, it is real life, but it is not familiar, but it is testing a familiar or a necessary competency, which means the child has to apply a filter, understand what's happening, maybe combine concepts, and is not able to simply recall or say, oh yes, I have done a question very similar to this and I will use that same approach. And we find that questions like this serve two purposes. I mean, not only are they interesting, for the child, but it kind of provokes them to think. And these can also identify, if they are developed carefully and based on how they are structured, gaps that are observed when children are learning these processes. So that's where the diagnosis aspect comes in. And it's not that one question will achieve all these goals. And it's not that every question in the paper, is going to be unfamiliar and so on. But some of the questions, when they do that, we kind of really encourage children to think in that way. But even more importantly, it gives teachers feedback. And when I say teachers, if it's a classroom test, the classroom teacher gets the feedback. But whenever it's at the system level, the system gets this input, which helps it at some level plan teacher training, but at a large scale level, even to look at textbooks and the kind of concepts. I remember early when we had started our acid test, we found that children in grades 4 and 5, were weak in the skill of estimation. So what would be how much is a meter? What is the amount of space that a vehicle would take? Different kinds of estimation skills which are very important in real life. And then based on that, over a period of years, we find that the curriculum also has emphasized these skills. So assessments also open a door towards those aspects that need to be understood and learned in the curriculum. So that's the one way of explaining the importance of questions. Many people have talked about the importance of teachers getting involved in this process. In fact, one of the things, we are also working with the CBSE. One of the things that we plan to do later in the year or next year is a question-making competition. Where teachers get a chance to participate in this process, but they both have certain tips and workshops to help them, but also guidelines from experts. And so this skill of both making and detecting good questions is something that develops in all teachers. At the same time, I want to contrast this point by saying that while it is important for all teachers to develop the skill, it's also important for a fixed group of people, or a small specialized group of people. So if I look at an assessment like SAFAL, one of the key things that we think can make something like SAFAL successful is that the people who are setting the SAFAL questions analyze, for example, the performance of the previous year's questions and look at, okay, so what does this show us about how children are thinking? What does this show us about the errors that children are making in understanding this concept in science or this fact in social studies? And then use that to design the next question. So there is a learning, just like everything else, is a skill. If I have to become a computer programmer, I develop that skill over a period of time. If I'm a skilled tailor, it's something I develop over time and I have expertise in that. In the same way, I become an expert in question making, not by simply making questions, but by then looking at how students answered it, what was the performance, using both quantitative, analytical techniques like IRT, but also qualitative and pedagogical. Like, does this error represent a challenge seen in children at the age of 11 or so? Even things like, how does learning on a question like this change from grades 4 to 5 to 6? We believe this should have been learned in grade 4, but what is the actual learning on this question in grade 7 and grade 8? And many studies have shown that there are such learning gaps, and this is quite common. And it also kind of is a message teachers immediately get it, that this has to be emphasized and learned well in that grade. So the importance of the question, the importance of capacity building, but also the importance of a group that is kind of developing these skills, looking at both qualitative and quantitative feedback. We talked about sample and census. I think so both have their role. I mean, it's obviously important when our schools go through assessments. It's a census assessment. Everybody is covered. A board exam is a census, and certain assessments. Many states today are doing census assessments. Samples are kind of more effective in inexpensive ways of identifying system level characteristics or system level weaknesses. So I would say that if we are moving a system from 50 or 60% to an 80 or a 90% in terms of improving, samples can help us a lot. If in case I have to then double down and really get to a level of improvement, I have a place for a census exam. Naturally, a census gives feedback at the level of the student, at the level of the teacher and the school, which a census would not give. But I think the common point in all of this is that so what happens if we do not use assessments? So if you look at a country like India, we have school assessments, we have the board exam, but we do not have something like, which is kind of giving us this feedback as a system. And what is the risk of that, or how can something like that help? So, economists use a term called isomorphic mimicry, or some people call it institutional isomorphism. So what this means is that often when we are trying to do something well, and this could be at a cluster level, it could be in a school, I look at certain practices because I find that a good system is using these practices. And then I try to use those practices here. So I say, okay, they are using this kind of a textbook. They're using this kind of a passage. PISA uses this kind of questions. And then I try and use those kinds of questions. You might have heard that we say that many parents say they want their children in poor, in village, rural areas. They say that our children must go to private schools. And why? Because they have that notion that going to a private school means whatever, they will learn English, they will learn good education. A lot of studies have shown this is not true. But this is an example of isomorphic mimicry, which is, I think that this characteristic, which is seen in good systems, is what is going to cause that goodness or the improvement. What is the way of knowing if a certain action or a certain step we have taken is really causing improvement, or it has caused improvement elsewhere, but that could be because of other reasons, and I need to understand that. And the only answer to that is assessments. Assessments, when done well, can give us a picture of what learning really is. They kind of give a continuity, because I can say that this is where we were and we have managed to bring an improvement in the last 2 years, and we can improve further as we go along. And I think that is where the opportunity lies, and it is like been amazing. We have been working with the CBSE for a while now, helping to both learn from them and to look at these aspects of question making and question analysis, creating the learning frameworks and so on. And I think this is a very, very important journey for the country, completely inspired by the NEP. And I think the role of assessments and initiatives like SAFAL in helping children across the country learn better is going to be like really, really important. And we really look forward to this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And when I was listening to you, I kept thinking that, assessment and pedagogy is run hand in hand in that. And that, the whole idea of, the age and stage focus, how do we look at that? Because that's another sort of issue that, one has to look at, especially because that has been mentioned in the NEP. And, for example, when you do a sort of a release model and it's all about, I do it, we do it, you do it, and how does this method of instruction include demonstration? How do we go forward with it? Because ultimately, when you do systemic education reforms, they also have to be systemic administrative reforms. So how do we look at this whole aspect of, and I think that's so well put by you when you were sort of deconstructing the role and how we take it forward. And especially when you talked about like every teacher cannot be integral to it. And then, we can learn in small clusters. And I agree with that. Thank you very much for those thoughts. With that, I request, I'm going to open this out to Vaijayanti. Vaijayanti, you have specialized in building assessments over the years at both level of policy and classrooms, and not focusing so much on how much or how many in terms of content and grading, but how and how well, in your own words. So could you comment on these milestone years of 3, 5, and 8? Because that also is something I personally would like to know, which do not speak of very high stake assessments, but helping in providing feedback on every child through a sense of assessment, And perhaps maybe later in the next question, in the next round, I would love to hear your thoughts on the understanding of data and there are so many other things that you do. But in this context, I'd be very interested in knowing your thoughts on, building assessment in these classes and commenting especially on the milestone years, on the sense of assessment. Because parents are getting nervous about, oh my God, are we going to start getting marked in classes 3, 5, and 8? Because so we'd like your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thanks, Amita ji. And before I start, my thanks to both Manoj ji and Joseph ji for giving me an opportunity to be here and share my thoughts. So before I comment on the milestone years, I just want to start with two things. Whenever we do assessments, especially SAFAL calling itself as a diagnostic test, it's important that it's able to connect to the classroom. It doesn't just stop with the policy, but it's important it connects to the classroom. And while exploring this thought, I wanted to actually share two personal anecdotes. So let me start with a story in mind. So, for example, in the early stages of my career as a teacher, I used to grade the answer scripts, and at the end of it, I used to write "can do better." And I used to also pride myself saying that that I'm doing more than what other teachers are doing, and I'm motivating my children and so on. With how useful it was, I realized it much later in my life when I became a researcher and I started working on large assessment data and so on, and also as a parent. So when I was working, my daughter, when in the 10th grade, she called me one day crying on the phone and said that she was called to the staff room and hauled up by the teacher, saying that the teacher had told her that you can do better in your test. And my daughter had actually scored 23 out of 25, but it was a board year and there was stiff competition within the teachers itself in the school. And the next section, the child had scored 24 out of 25. And so my daughter's teacher had written "can do better" and had actually told her, which is what gave her, gave rise to this crying binge. So I told her, but your teacher is so well-meaning, she understands you and she's motivating you. So why are you crying about it? So my daughter told me, so I prepared very well the first time when I wrote this test. And I ended up with 23 out of 25. Now the teacher is telling me that I can do better. So I'm going to prepare again the same way, but I'm not sure whether I'll end up with 23 or 20 or what. And I do not have any information which tells me how I should do better. So that is the first fundamental aha moment, where you have to realize that if you want children to really learn and do better, in whatever you call or you're measuring them on, you need to give them very, very granular information on where they are going wrong. So when we build assessments, the first fundamental thing, as Shrita had mentioned, when you're building assessments that gives diagnostic information, means you build questions where the wrong answer is more important than the right answer. So if somebody gets it right, all you know is that they get it right. But if somebody goes wrong, you really need to know what they're going wrong in, and so that you're able to give feedback and you can remedy. So that is the first thing. The second point we have to realize is that, so let us think of a scenario where a principal is calling a teacher and telling the teacher, I don't know what you will do. Now you have to do something in the classroom so all the classroom performs better. The teacher is, let us assume, a very hardworking teacher and a good teacher, understands her concepts, etc. But when she goes to the classroom, what does she do? She takes more, practice classes. She gives some extra lessons and so on and so forth. But it's basically a brute force approach where she's going to teach more of what she has been teaching the same way and hoping that her class performs better. Compare this to a scenario where you're actually able to say, see, in your class, your children are understanding the fractions you taught, but what we're understanding is that fraction means parts, but they're not understanding that the parts have to be equal. So if the teacher has this type of information, access to this type of information, teacher can quickly remedy it and actually can improve our learning. So the second point is that any assessment that we do has to be providing meaningful information to the teacher so that the system can improve. So now that is where SAFAL has to play a very big role. And I see SAFAL has a great advantage over the other national assessments. So for example, let us take a national achievement survey, the NAS that is getting done, and SAFAL is now going to be done for 358 as well. But both these assessments, and NAS also gets done in 358, incidentally, both call themselves diagnostic, both calls themselves, as system level assessments, and both are now also going to include private schools, most probably going forward. So in such a case, that how is it that SAFAL that is going to have a special advantage over NAS? Because if you want to really understand the system, the same as Sridhar said, yes, a sample study is enough to give you very granular information if the sample has been very well built and so on and so forth. But the advantage I see here is that SAFAL has been designed by NEP as a census level assessment, which means that every child is going to take this test, which is a low stakes exam and which is going to give diagnostic information. And every teacher, therefore, will have information about all the children in our class. So that means SAFAL, if it is really well administered and built, it has a chance of touching every child in our school system. But however, one caveat I would give here is that when SAFAL has to go and make itself really provide meaningful information, then these exams have to do something which has never been done in our country. What is that one thing? For example, you have to ensure that SAFAL actually produces performance benchmarks or performance levels. And for each of those benchmarks, whatever you may call it as proficient, advanced, average, or above average, or whatever basic, or whatever you set as your performance level, for each of these performance levels, it has to develop performance descriptors and actually do a proper, robust standard setting methodology to fix cut scores. So in this test, if the child is scoring this, he's at the basic level. If the child is scoring this, he's in the advanced level. And because the information is well known, so for example, we have done this standard setting exercise in other countries as well, for the national assessments, and even in India for an early childhood tool developed by World Bank, UNICEF, and CSET, and so on. So this methodology is available, but this needs to be administered. And why is this important? Because this is driven from the curriculum. Usually we do something called as a scale anchoring exercise where we understand what children at the different ability levels are able to do. But in that case, it comes from the data. And especially in states, etc., you know that in our country, the level of learning is low. When the level of learning itself is low, then you basically are understanding what children in those ability buckets are able to do. Whereas when you take it from the standard setting, cut score, performance benchmarks, methodology, you are setting it at the level of the curriculum. So that means you are basically able to say right from the beginning what level the children should be, what should be expected, what is the knowledge and ability that each level should be, and how many children are going to be like that. So, and if this is done, and then this feedback is given to every child and teacher because the data is available and so on and so forth, it will be a phenomenal way in which you can give feedback, which is very meaningful to move the system up. And along with this question on 358, why is 358? So, for example, if you want to really remedy learning, especially learning with understanding, you have to ensure that you are starting low, like in the sense that at the early stages, if the early foundational stages are not really dealt with in the right way, then a learning deficit accumulates, and at a later stage, it is very, very difficult to remedy that. And again, when you're doing this, you don't need to test the child in every year, because the skills have its own way of growing, etc. So you test at certain intervening years with a certain sort of a longitudinal gap given. But because we are doing for every child, for 358, that means in a matter of 5 years, you will be able to actually build a learning profile or a learning genome, as I call it, for every student. And that data will be very, very valuable for the student, the teacher, and the parent to see that the child is actually able to progress well. And more importantly here, when SAFAL is talking of assessments, etc., one of the key things that I would want to raise here is also that in the 21st century, is academic learning alone enough? Because we know that the world is going to be very, very different. And for example, the Global 2020 report to the World Economic Forum actually says that mental depression is going to be the second largest killer in this decade, next only to cardiac problems. And most of our children are in the vulnerable age group for mental depression, which means that we need to ensure that the SEL skills, the social emotional skills, get into the curricula, and you also have to measure it. And why SAFAL is important, again, if you measure it, then you have a better chance of getting it into the curriculum. It's if you have it in the curriculum, you really do not know whether it's still going to be measured. But if you start really measuring it, you will know that it will definitely get into the curriculum. So that's what we would say. And here in this SEL areas, we have been working on the last 5 years, really, really trying to understand, therefore, what do you mean by these social emotional skills? What exactly are these? Are these something that you can actually build, or are children born with it, or they can develop it? And if they can develop it, then, what should we be doing about it? And then what should we be measuring it? How do you measure it? For example, you take the case of empathy. Empathy, if you say, is a skill that the children needs to have, how do you measure it? Because I may be empathetic in the morning, but not in the evening. I may be empathetic to one person, not to another person. I may be empathetic to one cause, but not another cause. When it's such a moving construct, then how do you actually go about measuring that? So that is what we have been doing. And maybe if Amita ji gives me a chance, the next question, I will talk more about what we have been doing here, so that SAFAL is starting to incorporate that as well in their assessment methodology. Thank you.
That's absolutely wonderful, Vaijayanti ji. Thank you so much. And I think, the whole movement of, a learner profile and the learning progression, especially in the foundational years, I think that is so important, because it plays a significant role in understanding priorities of students and nudging teachers to meet their learning needs. So I think that's very essential. And principally, I think it's very well defined learning indicators with multiple methods of teaching and learning, and fairness in assessments will just definitely enable a robust learning system. And I do agree with you that learning happens around an emotional experience. You love your teacher, she likes you, she loves you, you learn better. So definitely in the next round, we'd love to hear your thoughts on social emotional skills, or SEL, as you just mentioned. So with that, thank you again. And with that, I move forward to Jayashree ji. So Jayashree, how do formative assessments get embedded in a system? Because teachers often feel limited in the context. And how do you think of sequencing assessment systems? You're one of the members of the Parak committee, and the importance is also to ensure rehabilitation of data. So how would you look at all these aspects? You've also worked in the area of data sanctity and security. And so would you share your views with us on also on how to deal with school and board assessment, or maybe you could do that in round 2. So I'd be very interested to know how you look at these issues that I've just brought up after conversations with you. Thank you so much, Jayashree.
Would like to start by thanking CBSE and all the panelists for such a wonderful opportunity to hear all of you and to participate. In terms, I want to start with the idea of SAFAL, and given the examination has such a, are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes, very clear.
That it's quite an examination-driven culture. And when we're talking about census assessment, which obviously brings in more of a pressure on system in terms of from the child to teacher to parents to the whole lot. How do we turn this idea around in terms of that it does not incentivize, incentivize more fear, but also is seen as something which will help. So census assessment, for example, give you more granular, information. It also, because schools have been doing assessment from small tests to everything, but when you are assessing on a common and a comparable metric, the relative strength and weaknesses can become more obvious and be presentable, because we are talking about SAFAL and all. I mean, from Manojji to panelists, we all talk about it being diagnostic. And I really want to stay with that word, because when we talk about diagnosis, what does it mean? In our health parlance, we look at diagnosis is you got a result, but it should also give you way forward to say, what will I need to do? But just diagnosis itself is not going to change anything. You have to do something about it. Your point on formative assessment. I also want to touch upon a couple of points that Sridhar and later Vaijanti also talked about. If you look at some of the international practices, particularly on like a key stage examination, which is at grade 2 and 6 in UK, or on other NAPLAN at Australia and all, I think 2 or 3 key things that we need to keep in mind is, one is your assessment framework and therefore resultant items. They're really good, because diagnosis will not help if that basis are not really sound. How are we providing results? So I think Vaijanti talked about, whether the child is at a beginning stage, is it at a, meets the expectations or exceeds the expectation, whatever rubric we create. But instead of going into specific marks and, all that traditionally one has been used to, if we are able to do that, those kind of setting this kind of standards, that is going to truly help. And competency based assessment, I think that is another phrase that we've been hearing. I think unless we are able to bring that into SAFAL, that it is competency based, it has a strong assessment framework and resultant items, and the manner in which provide results, all that needs to change in order for us to get to a place where we say we will be able to use this entire assessment findings in a diagnostic manner. What will that mean? And I'm going to make a point, probably it might be slightly controversial, but I do want to say that while we may have wonderful exemplary teachers, they may know a lot of content. I think an assessment competency, not only teachers, I'm talking about system. I do not believe that we have strong assessment, scientific assessment professionals, barring, of course, my eminent panelists who are sitting here. But so at both levels, at the system level, as well as at the school level, bringing in, ensuring that the technical expertise are built. So when I talk about, let us say, board or at a system level, I think starting with what is the objective of assessment? Each assessment must have an objective to which you are, because objective then will lead to who is the end user of this assessment findings, and therefore, and what is the objective? What do they need? What do they need to know? Is it the system? Is it the parent? Is it? And in this case, we are saying it's diagnostic. That means certainly the schools need to know, teachers need to know, and the system needs to know, whether it is at a cluster level, state level, or the board level. So I think at both level, diagnostic word and a phrase and its actual meaning needs to be playing it out. What kinds of competencies? So I started by saying, okay, does the board or the system which plans the assessment, are we clear about the objectives? What is it that we want to find out? Is there enough expertise? And all this need to be built. So there's not a complaint. It's just that how do we make sure that robust assessment framework is developed, strong items which are competency based, they are developed. We have a standardized methodology of implementing assessment on the field so that we do get authentic data. How is it being analyzed? Once again, are there standards to doing that? And then how are we reporting it? So at a system level, there needs to be competencies built to do all this. At a school level, and that is one of the reasons, because normally I would say census assessments are far more expensive on a variety of fronts, besides fund, time, effort, everything. But if we can truly use this as a diagnostic, then at a school level, even at a school level, I would say at a system, teacher, and a child level. What do I mean by system? When the finding comes around, which tells us that there are certain competencies in which our children are weak, we need to look at how much time on task, what is the timetabling, who are the teachers who are teaching it, what is the learning material we provide, how can we enhance that learning material, increase in the areas in which our children are not doing well, whether it is specific to science, certain concepts in mathematics. That's at the system level at the school, where leadership plays a part. At an individual teacher level, when you get that data at a school level, and this is the, unlike achievement surveys, which are sample based, here at a school level, you're going to get data which will tell you subject by subject, and teachers can look at and reflect. So we talk about, teachers being reflective practitioners. What will that mean? When we talk about formative assessment, our teachers, having looked at this analytical once in a year kind of thing, are they constantly now going into on a weekly basis? Karthik a while back talked about we have those weekly tests or a unit test and those things. Yes, we do have the test. The culture, what does not exist is using the data emanating from the assessment, whether it is National Achievement Survey or a weekly test in the classroom. So formative assessment to me would mean creating a reflective practice at all levels. What do my children know at the end of this unit that I've taught? What do they know and what they don't know? Which are the parts they're weak? It's not about assessing child and giving them feedback, which should be done, but more importantly, seeking feedback for yourself to say, if a large number of my students did not learn something, what may I do to improve that? And therefore, change the pedagogy. I think Vajanti made a very valid point, and something that you teach more of the same in the same manner, and children are not getting it. How do you change? So actually, when we talk about formative assessment is, of course, the periodicity, how do we present it? Very often, even I think Sridhar mentioned that even states have gone to taking the census assessment, all the data goes up. When there is not a scientific method of analyzing, ensuring that the assessments are valid, there is a scare in the schools and amongst the teacher, and there is a perverse incentive to inflate your results. I think that, how do we break that cycle? We can only break that cycle when we become more authentic, which is what brings me to the question of, briefly on data. But I do want to emphasize, when we here mentioned that the pedagogy and assessment need to go side by side. Whenever we talk about formative assessment, very often people think, oh, at the end of the week or at the end of fortnight. As a teacher, my thing would be to say, when you are teaching, there is formative assessment. After your concept has been shared, you're going to even say thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs on the sideways. That's formative. So ask closed questions, which is conceptual, and ask the children, am I saying the right statement? Thumbs up. Not right, not understood. And I know how many, 50% of my child, or even 10% of my children have said this. I need to do something about it there and then. And I think those simple concepts we are unable to practice. More of analytical, SAFAL kind of annual assessment becomes more analytical, gives you feedback in a manner that the previous panelists have spoken about. What it would do is it would make teachers and schools be more reflective and granularly break it down the tasks. I will just take a last few minutes in terms of the data. Data being valid, being reliable is the most important. Once we start such an endeavor, and if the data is not reliable, slowly the trust deficit increases. There will be more fear factor. How do we ensure that? And how is it managed well? I think there could be a whole session on that. But ensuring that we give a reliable data, and therefore using that, give a reliable feedback, not only to the system, to the schools, definitely, but also to the society, to the parents. And very often parents can use the data also to help their own children learn and be able to, or even work with the schools in a close manner. Could even potentially even look at the schools, different schools, because they're all being great, they're all taking the same assessment. Therefore, I would like to close here because I know we have a very little time, but there will be question answers and I'll be happy to respond to that. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these wonderful thoughts. And I will definitely get back to you because I think there was a very important point that we talked about when we said, so how can this be deconstructed in the 15 lakh schools across rural India and across states? And how could assessments be understood at that level? And how do we converge that understanding? Because, at one level, we have 22,000 schools, at the other level that, and NEP has talked about a convergence of the center and the state, and how do we take it forward? So it'd be very interesting to hear your thoughts on that. What I plan to do now is that if we could just go take a quick round again, because these are such interesting thoughts that you have just ideated and talked about, that I would like very much that if educators like me could be left with something really, that we could take back and say, yes, this is something I can talk to my teacher about. Whatever you've said has been extremely interesting, but if you could sort of encapsulate something that you feel is absolutely essential and that would help us as educators to take back and think about it, ponder upon, deconstruct it in our classrooms in a way, big or small, because we are still in the nascent stage of understanding assessments. So on that level, I now seek Ritika, who started this wonderful, I won't call it panel, but roundtable, sort of techno roundtable. So it would be very nice if Ritika gave her thoughts on this. Sorry, Ritika, is the audio off? If you'd like to get ready, then I can ask. I can ask Karthik. Karthik, would you like to? I was listening to your champion reforms and your thoughts. Karthik, would you like to sort of give us some last thoughts on what you'd like to say?
Okay, so I was carefully listening to the rest of our colleagues on the panel as well, and I think I agree with most of views here. I just wanted to actually err on the side of caution on one point, and I think that's a message I think for which I'm trying to send across to any of the school principals and leaders out there, to the champions of the cause at CBSE and everywhere. You see, it's taken us time to start formulating our roadmap from curriculum to competency, right? And I saw in the SAFAL document mentions of how there could be this emergence of this diagnostic assessment as a means of really monitoring schools and quality and performance, which really starts adding a dimension of high stakes to it, not in terms of defining children's next steps, perhaps in their academic journey, but in many ways creates a sense of pressure, maybe at times unnecessary pressure in school ecosystem, among schools as well as teachers. At a time, then we must realize that when we have taken this longer time to start thinking about this transition, to expect teachers to make that transition overnight or rather quickly will not be a very fair ask. So I think in that sense, keeping the diagnostic to a level of empowering teachers, I think that should be the message we take from here. And I also just wanted to conclude by saying that I think one great service CBSE will be providing to all its affiliate schools is the research function, as Vaijanti was also mentioning. And I think it's not just in terms of the research in terms of what is coming out, but really research which equalizes their achievement. So when we for it, and now I might be erring on the side of diagnosis in terms of how people are performing, but you may find that within schools, children, when you normalize for their socio-cultural backgrounds and their ecosystems that they come from, certain schools at the prima facie may appear as if they're doing, their kids may be underperforming others, but you actually may find that they're outperforming others when it comes to the background from where they're bringing in children and the level to which they're elevating them. So I think the research function, CBSE championing it, academic, non-academic sides, is definitely a great service to CBSE schools and otherwise. And I'll also just conclude again with the message saying that we should keep this low stakes in terms of not creating that pressure environment or undue pressure for teachers, but really using this to empower them. I'll just stop there with my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Karthik, because that's a big relief to us as teachers, because we are practically we are sort of hopefully on a road to recovery. First, we were responding to the pandemic, and we were just going on with the onlines, which was not very, which was a huge challenge. And now we're in a sort of a recovery mode. And now with the recovery mode, we're really going to look forward to understanding a completely new way of thinking. And the way ahead. So with that, I'd like to get back to Ritika if she's there.
Yes.
And yeah,
Can you
please,
hear
Ritika.
me?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'd like to say that I really enjoyed being a part of the panel today because I am not an academician or an assessment expert, but more a project manager in that sense and a system implementation of project change. And one of the things that strike me as a parallel to things that happen is that this is a big change management project, the NEP itself, and with very, many parts. And any change goes with a little bit of grieving and then an acceptance of the disorder that happens thereafter, and then you get your directions out there. And a shift in culture alongside that is very critical. And a big part of the shift in culture is around how we communicate the purpose of that change. And I think that we all as individuals, as leaders of organizations and as principals out there, have a job to do in communicating the purpose. And as successfully as we will communicate it, we will be able to find support for what we are trying to do in that, and that trust factor will come through it. So that's one of the things that I would really suggest to people is to spend some time thinking about how we are talking about what we are going about it, because that's going to buy acceptance, and when it's going to get acceptance and trust, it's going to succeed in that sense. So that would be my sort of one key thing that I'd like to leave with those who are joining the session today and my colleagues here.
Thank you very much for that. Sridhar, any last thoughts, so to speak? Be very interested to hear. It'd be nice to hear about scalability model.
Yeah. No, I think the message I would like to leave with to principals is that assessments should be giving you, like, it should be, every assessment should give you something that is really useful, something that you did not know, and yet you can verify and it is correct. So we say something which was non-obvious but yet true. If it was non-obvious and wrong, it doesn't help, but non-obvious and true.
Yeah.
Now, how can we do this? One or two suggestions is that in every assessment, even in the school, like 1 or 2 questions are focused. So out of the whole paper, are focused on this kind of research of learning, and that can get discussed. In some cases, duplicate a question across grades 5, 6, and 7, and then have teachers discuss what they found from that. A variation of the same thing is that, what is it that the children are learning? What has happened when you look at a longitudinal thing like between grade 4 and grade 8? So basically, I would say be more demanding in terms of what you are getting out of an assessment. Just through playing around and thinking about 1 or 2 questions, you'll be surprised the extent to which it will build the capacity of your teachers and get them excited, and indirectly get the children excited for learning. And that is the only way we can increase this. We want to create this change in the country. It's not going to happen at a top-down level, but this is the way in which schools, teachers can get involved. And that, to me, is the way that we can really scale up this to a real change.
That's wonderful, Sridhar. In fact, I think I loved one of my teachers so much because instead of asking me the usual question of when was the Treaty of Versailles signed, I was asked that if you were to sign the Treaty of Versailles and you were on the draft committee, what kind of a treaty would you have signed? So that really got us thinking, and I think you're absolutely right. The question is what is most essential. Thank you so much for those lovely remarks that you've just given. Vaijayanti ji, back to you now. We would like some more, if you could just give us some more thoughts on cell, because a lot of schools are looking at creating cell labs and, cell sort of, what shall I say, awareness situations where children can connect at a deeper level. So some more thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So this is a very important area, right? So just to continue with what I shared, that mental depression is going to be one of the largest killers. But also we know that COVID has struck us, and then children are now in all virtual isolation and just connecting on the line and more or less isolated to a large extent. And we hear of that this is going to have a large impact on the health and the well-being of our children. And the future is also going to be so technology driven that this isolation to some extent is going to continue and not become less. And also therefore when we are talking of smartness of children or how they evolve, it's a very different type of smart that we are going to be looking at. It is just not scores on your exam, but it is something that how you are able to holistically handle the changing scenario, which is going to change much more faster as we go about and so on. So that is where the SEL work comes in. So fundamentally, when we started working in this area from 2015 onwards, when we realized that SDGs were talking about schools being the places where interpersonal and social skills have to be built, then we questioned ourselves, what are these interpersonal and social skills? But there's a plethora of them, and different people refer to different things. The same word has different meanings for different people. When there's no common understanding, then it's very, very difficult to sort of even figure out and standardize and start giving feedback to people further. So we started really looking at, therefore, what are these social emotional skills? What do we mean by interpersonal social skills? And what are those that can be inculcated in a classroom, and that to be a teacher, and so on and so forth. And then we very quickly realized that this terminology issue is not only in India, but across the world. Globally, this is what is happening. The second issue is that then after we figure out that this is so and so, for example, then you have to figure out whether it is first of all measurable. So not all of these skills need to be measured and can be measured as well. It could be something that can keep changing so fast that it is impossible to measure, and therefore how do you measure it at scale? Quite often you would find that counselors are there in most schools, and you know that if a child is having some interpersonal problems, schools will refer their child to the counselor. Counselor will give some tests, and then they observe and so on. But you're going to do it at scale, because you're saying that every child should have interpersonal well-being and social well-being. So if that is the case, then you have to build an assessment. So when we started working on these, then we realized that when you build assessment tools, quite often you have things like what we call as self-reports, or things where children will start giving very quickly giving aspirational answers. Like what we call as something called as an observer effect, or what we call as an evaluation effect. So if I know that I'm going to be observed, I will be cautious of how I'm saying, or if I know that I'm going to be judged, I would be cautious again of how I respond, and so on and so forth. So how do you address, and how do you, because unless social emotional measurements also evolve to a level the same way what academic assessments are now doing, in terms of giving that these are the misconceptions, these are the common errors, and this is the diagnosis, and so on and so forth, and you are able to do it at scale, then SEL will always be very, very limited to the ability of the teacher and her ability to observe the classroom and the child in the classroom, etc. So here we have been doing this work for the last 4 years, and we carried out large-scale assessments on this across 3 states and 5 metro cities, including CBSE schools, which the city people judged as the best schools in those cities, etc. So we look at 4 different things here. So when you say SEL, so you have to understand that SEL is different from, there are different aspects to SEL. So when you say SEL, there could be what we call as an emotional concept attainment, or emotional regulation, or behavior regulation. This is one strand of it. There could be another aspect where you talk of attitude, values, and beliefs. That is, your values and beliefs drive your attitude, whether you're positive towards yourself, or your like a gender, or your school activities, or your teacher, and so on. So the attitudes are driven by that. And third, most importantly, is that if you have to build all of these things, you have to build a very inclusive and what I call as a pro-social environment. The school climate is very important. So if you go to our website and our YouTube channel, you'll find a lot of videos where we have spoken about how school climate is very related to mental health, and mental health is again very, very related to how they perform in academic learning. So you find that they are all very, very seamlessly interconnected and so on. And more importantly, therefore, when we're talking of 21st century skill, we should also, in the academic sense also, we should focus more on what we call as the transversal skills. That means like the critical thinking or problem solving stuff, which are more common and across the domain, so that the child is able to actually manage themselves to the future that is evolving, and with a future which is so going to be so ambiguous, which we are not clear, and so on and so forth. So very broad thoughts at this stage. I gave you a lot of information, but would love to have a more detailed conversation with some of you who are interested in knowing about it or knowing about our assessments in this space.
Thank you so much. That was so holistic. And I think the learning matrices that we create should all have, skills, values, as you said, beliefs, and that really will help us in the learner profile as the child moves forward. Thank you very much for that. And I'll definitely be contacting you for more conversations on this. Of course, now we have Jayashree, the last but not the least. I mean, I would really like you to put some kind of on the macrocosm that you were talking about with me about. It'd be very interesting to know, because you've done so much of work across the country at various states, and how do you look at that, and how do you look at the macrocosm meeting the microcosm, so to speak, the core. Jayashree.
Thank you. Of course, this initially SAFAL is being will be tried out, piloted, etc., in CBSE school. And as you rightly said, when we're talking about limited number of schools and seemingly like more privileged, now it could be because of the wherewithal and the quality of human resource, etc. What would be really great is, because when we are talking about small segment of the schools vis-a-vis large, we are talking about like 15 lakh schools in the country, and in from rural to urban to least resource to more resourced, etc. I think somewhere as we go forward, and when a good practice begins, like CBSE would do with SAFAL, other boards, and there is, and if you look at the context of the NEP, there is an expectation that across the country we will have this SAFAL kind of exams, assessments. I think the challenge for us would be that when CBSE is taking this forward, how well do we document it? Particularly the human resource, capacity, how do we increase? Institutional capacity, how do we increase? Particularly communication, which Ritika raised. And I do believe that communication to parents, to schools, to teachers of what is this assessment expecting to do. I think even much before actual the assessments are conducted, that's going to be critically important. Because once we know the objective of it, it begins to kind of give clarity to say what is expected of me. I do believe that we will have to go cautiously. We will have to take our time, ensure that the capacities of institutions, and fortunately NEP also creates room for example, there will be assessment cells and centers in each of the states, right? Besides the examination boards. And my hope would be that those assessment cells are not focusing on the board kind of the terminal examination outlook. They would focus more on more formative, more SAFAL kind of assessments, and build capacity to, once again, to have a robust, strong assessment frameworks, be able to actually administer that well, be able to have a data management systems and capacity, and be able to share. The other point I want to raise, particularly for the principals, whether wherever they may be, whether in government, private, CBSE or other schools, is beginning at small in terms of local level school-based research, because this whole idea of diagnostic assessment and how do we use the finding of the data. For example, for many years I've maintained that teachers labor hour upon hours, hundreds of hours in a year on correcting the notebooks of the students, right? And those assignments. Very little research, even by that individual teacher, after the next assignment comes in and that's got corrected. I think over time, we have not looked at whether children went back to look at those mistakes. Have they made any changes? Basis the feedback given. Feedback is, I mean, in my view, feedback is a breakfast for champion. When you get feedback, you need to digest it. I don't believe we've created that culture. I think that kind of small research, we're not looking at, research is often is seen as more academic university kind of. I think we need to do small level research, analyze the data which is available to us on our table, and that is how we'll begin to change the culture. So whether it is a small rural school or big schools, we need to begin to spread this message, encourage this a lot. I think a lot capacities need to be built. The understanding diagnosis, what does it mean? What can we learn from that? That culture needs to get built. Institutions need to get strengthened. And most importantly, in no manner, in communication, in documents, in our manner in which we conduct assessments, that we are not sending a message that it is to create league tables. We don't want to compare schools. I think Karthik mentioned that we are starting at a very different, the baseline at a base level is very, very different. How are we able to encourage the schools through these assessments in process, because it would be based on such standard metrics, and in a way that's a good thing, because then I know as a school head, where am I? But that shouldn't be a demotivating thing to say, hey, I need to now do something to increase no, I need to increase learning. How can we create that culture? In my view, it's going to be a few years, and my hope is that we don't rush into saying every board in the country will begin to do this, etc. Let's learn from CBSE experiment. Let's document it well. Let's create programs which will help other boards and other systems, and including schools, to be able to learn from there. I think that would be really my wish. And principals actually are the leaders to this, because we are in a service sector. Delivery of our service is taking place in our classrooms and in our schools, not at the state of secretaries' offices. They're all enabling. They will enable you. District level officials can enable the schools, but schools is the heart where the change can take place. And that is why the principals and others who are around, I do believe, I have great respect for teachers and principals like even Amita here, that's where the change is taking place. And how can we empower them to say you can make this change in a meaningful manner? I think I would close with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, this been an awesome afternoon, if I may use that word. And you are the assessment gurus. So I would like to say that you've moved me, and I'm sure the entire audience, from the intimate to the ultimate, and then back again from the ultimate to the intimate. So it's been a 360-degree holistic experience listening to all of you. And what a fantastic panel. May I take you home with me so I don't have problems about assessment? It'll be fantastic. And with that, thank you for being with us. And you've made my work so simple. With that, I request Dr. Shweta Singh, a friend, a colleague, to give her last winding up remarks. Thank you, Shweta.
Thank you, ma'am. As we come to the end of this fantastic webinar, I would like to thank the expert panel. Indeed, it has been a beautiful evening and extremely beneficial session. Lots of insight about SAFAL have been shared. Besides these, all of you have shared valuable views on good quality assessment, how it should enhance learning, and how it should lead to reflective practices in our classrooms. We've had a lot of takeaways from this session, so each one of us, be it those engaged in developing policies, the school leaders, the teachers, and parents, of course. I would also like to thank Dr. Vatan. Ma'am, you have beautifully led the discussion, shared your experiences and insights. Thank you so much. I also would like to thank the CBSE leadership, Chairman Sir, Dr. Joseph, Dr. Johari, Dr. Chaudhary. Besides that, my colleagues, Dr. Pragya Singh, Sudeshji and her team, and Manishji for organizing these webinar series. And of course, our wonderful stakeholders, the participants who have logged in and spent a lot of time, given a lot of attention and time to all of us. Thank you so much. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you so much.